From everywhere, "This warship is old, Captain. It remembers things you were never meant to know." Cathiel clenched his jaw. "Then why are you talking to us? Why not just kill us?" The voice laughed, a low, crawling, inhuman laugh that seemed to leak from the walls. "Kill you? Oh no, Captain, you're missing the point." A whisper of movement. Close, too close. Kethel snapped his rifle up, scanning the dim corridor. Rathak was already crouched, his own weapon aimed at the shifting dark. Varys had his back against a console, breathing hard. Then Gina gasped. Her eyes were wide, locked on the window behind them. Kethel turned. Outside, beyond the reinforced glass, space stretched into infinity. The wreckage of the last battle drifted, silent and cold. But that wasn't what made Kethel's stomach drop. It was the shapes. Figures moved among the debris. Dozens of them. They weren't in ships. They weren't in suits. They were just walking, and their faces. Kethel felt his breath hitch. He recognized them. Gina's voice was barely a whisper. "Those are our crew." "No," Varys said, shaking his head in terror. "Those are the dead." Rathak's grip on his rifle tightened. "They're watching us." Then one of the figures turned. Its face was wrong, not rotted, not alien, just off. Like someone had remembered what a human looked like, but had never seen one before. Its mouth moved, and through the ship's dead speakers, its voice came clear as day. "Let us in!" Gina screamed. Kethel grabbed her shoulder, snapping her back to the moment. "We keep moving, now." Gina was shaking, but she nodded. They turned and stopped, because standing in the corridor ahead was themselves. 4 figures, same uniforms, same faces, staring back. And they were smiling. Cathiel's breath turned shallow, his body locking up as he stared into the identical eyes of his own copy. The 4 doppelgangers stood motionless, their smiles stretched just a bit too wide, their eyes a little too bright, like someone had studied what expressions should look like, but had never quite understood them. Gina took a trembling step backward. This isn't real." The other Gina tilted her head at the exact same angle, mocking her. Then, as one, the copies spoke. "What makes you so sure?" Varys cursed under his breath. Rathak's grip on his weapon tightened until his claws scraped against the metal casing. Kethel swallowed. "What do you want?" The copies didn't answer. Instead, they stepped forward. Not a normal step. Not human. Too smooth, too synchronized, too wrong. Rathak fired first. A burst of blue plasma tore through the chest of his double. The shot hit, but didn't stop anything. The wound didn't bleed. It simply closed up, as if the damage had never happened at all. Then the fake Rathak laughed, a low, crawling echo of Rathak's own voice. "That won't work," it whispered. Gina grabbed Kethel's arm. "We need to run." "Agreed," Varys choked out. Kethel took a step back, but froze. Something was behind them. He felt it before he saw it. The air had thickened, heavy with the feeling of being watched. Slowly, carefully, Kethel turned, and saw a new figure. This one was different, larger, stranger. It wasn't a copy of them. It was something else entirely. Its body was a patchwork of flesh and metal, shifting and reforming like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Its eyes, too many of them, glowed with a sickly, faint blue light. And it was smiling, too. Gina's breathing turned ragged. That's not one of us." The thing tilted its head. Then, in a voice that wasn't quite a whisper, wasn't quite a growl, it spoke. "You don't belong here." Rathak aimed his weapon again, but Kethel grabbed his wrist. "Don't," he muttered. The larger creature's many eyes blinked, slowly, one by one. Then it pointed, not at Kethel, not at Gina, at the copies. Kethel's stomach tightened. "Wait, are you saying—" The creature moved, and for the first time the copies reacted. Their smiles vanished. Their eyes widened in shock, and in unison they screamed. Not words, not even a sound that belonged in this world. It was a raw, horrible wail, like the tearing of metal and the shattering of glass. Then they ran. The fake crew bolted down the corridor, their movements jerky and unnatural, scrambling away from the new thing that had appeared. The larger creature watched them go. Then, slowly, it turned its gaze back to Kethel and his crew. For a long, horrible moment, nobody moved. Then, in a voice like static and forgotten memories, it spoke again. They should not have touched the ship. Kethel's skin crawled. What are they? The thing tilted its head. Its mouth moved wrong, like it was unused to forming words. Reflections? Gina took a step closer. Then what? Are you? The creature stared at her for a long time. Then it smiled again. The warden? A deep rattling groan echoed through the ship. The walls shuddered. The air grew heavier. And in the distance, the sound of more footsteps. Not just 4, hundreds. Kethel's blood ran cold. We need to move. The warden simply nodded, and then, for the first time, it turned and started walking. It expected them to follow. Kethel wasn't sure which was worse, the smiling copies of his crew or the thing leading them deeper into the warship. The warden moved with unnatural ease, gliding more than walking, its many glowing eyes never blinking. The further they followed it, the more wrong the ship felt. The halls stretched, twisting in ways that made no sense. Bulkheads that should have been solid steel rippled like water, and shadows pooled in the corners, moving against the light. The reflections were still out there. Kethel could hear them. The scuttling of feet, the soft, horrible whispers, the occasional sharp scrape of fingernails on metal. They were hunting, but for now, they weren't attacking. The warden had scared them. Gina kept close, her fingers twitching near the pistol at her side. "Where are we going?" she whispered. The warden didn't stop walking, but it answered. "To the ship's heart." Rathak flicked his tail. His voice was tight with suspicion. "And what happens when we get there?" The warden turned its head slightly. Not all the way, just enough to let them see its grin. "You survive." Nobody liked that answer, but the alternative, turning back, was worse. As they moved, Kethel couldn't help but notice the ship itself changing. The deeper they went, the older it seemed. Panels no longer looked like military-grade steel, but something else entirely. Something ancient, something grown rather than built. Then a door, a massive circular hatch, covered in layers of strange markings. Not human, not anything Kethel had seen before. The warden stopped. "Here." Gina's eyes flicked over the door. "What's inside?" The warden tilted its head. "The crew." Varys stiffened. "The real crew?" The warden turned its many-eyed gaze toward him. "Yes." Kethel exhaled. This was it. If there were any answers, they were on the other side of that door. He pressed his hand against the surface. It was cold, and then it moved. Not like a door unlocking, like something on the other side had felt him, and was pushing back. Gina shuddered. "I don't like this." "None of us do," Rathak muttered. The warden watched them, patient. "Decide quickly. The reflections will not wait forever. Kethel turned his head just slightly, listening. The whispers in the corridors were growing louder. They were running out of time, so he took a breath. And pushed. The hatch shuddered, then peeled open. Not sliding, not turning. Peeling, like something organic. And beyond it, darkness. Kethel stepped forward, and the ship welcomed him. At first he thought it was empty. Then the shadows shifted, and Kethel realized they weren't alone. Figures stood in the dark, not moving, not speaking. Hundreds of them. They weren't wearing modern uniforms. Their clothing was old, almost prehistoric by human standards. Some had missing limbs. Some had holes where their faces should have been. All of them were still. Gina gripped Kethel's sleeve. "Kethel, are they alive?" The warden answered. "They are remembering." Kethel swallowed hard. Remembering what? The warden turned its many eyes toward him, and for the first time, its smile faded. What this ship was before it became a weapon. Kethel didn't understand, not fully. But then one of the figures moved, a slow, creaking turn of the head, and though it had no eyes, no mouth, somehow Kethel felt it looking at him, and it whispered, "You are the last." Kethel's breath caught in his throat. The warden watched, silent, waiting, and in the distance. The whispers of the reflections turned to screams. They were coming, and the crew had only seconds to decide what to do next. The shadows whispered. The figures in the dark remained still, their presence pressing against Kethel's mind like a weight he didn't know how to lift. Outside the chamber, the reflections were coming. Fast. Their twisted, smiling voices filled the corridors, growing louder, closer. The ship shuddered, its very structure groaning under an invisible force. Gina's breath hitched. "Kethel, we have to—" Then the figures moved. Not all of them, just one. A tall, hollow-eyed figure stepped forward, the dim light flickering across its face, or what was left of it. Its skin was pale, stretched too tightly over its bones. Its mouth didn't move, but somehow, when it spoke, Kethel felt its voice inside his skull. "The cycle repeats." Varys flinched. What cycle? Another figure shifted, its neck creaked, head tilting toward them in a slow, unnatural motion. The warship was not built, it was found. Rathak narrowed his eyes, tail flicking in unease. That doesn't make sense. Human engineers. The figures all turned their hollow gazes toward him at once. Gina gasped, and in unison they whispered. Human engineers built upon what they did not understand. Kethel's stomach twisted. The air was getting heavier, as if the ship itself was listening. The warden remained silent, watching.
Gina shook her head, her fingers tightening around Kethel's sleeve. "Kethel, we don't have time for riddles. The reflections—"
The ship shuddered violently, and then the screaming stopped. Silence. Not the silence of peace, the silence of something watching. Varys gritted his teeth. That's not good. And then the door behind them began to open, not peel, not slide. Something on the other side was forcing its way through. A single hand reached in first. It had too many fingers, and they were all smiling. Gina's breath caught in her throat. Oh! Kethel fired first. A plasma bolt tore through the hand, but instead of pulling back, it split apart, the fingers unraveling into something thin, like tendrils of smoke. And then they reached. Faster than anyone could react, one tendril wrapped around Varys's wrist. He screamed, but it wasn't just pain. It was worse. His eyes went wide, His pupils dilated, and for half a second his face twisted into the same awful stretched smile as the reflections. Then the warden moved. It didn't walk. It didn't even appear to turn. It was just there. One massive clawed hand grasped the tendrils wrapped around Varys and ripped them apart. The reflections on the other side howled. Varys collapsed, gasping. His fingers twitched, his whole body shaking. Jaina and Rathak rushed to him. Kethel turned toward the warden. What did they do to him? The warden's many eyes blinked, one by one. They tried to replace him. Kethel felt a cold chill run down his spine. Replace? A loud, wet crack echoed from the other side of the door. Jaina snapped her head up. They're coming through. Rathak lifted Varys onto his shoulders, the smaller man still shivering. We need an exit now. The hollow-eyed figures in the chamber watched them all. Then one of them, the first one that spoke, lifted an arm. A wall at the far end of the room slid open. Beyond it, another passage. The warden nodded. This way. Kethel didn't hesitate. Move. Jaina and Rathak hurried through the passage, Varys barely conscious between them. Kethel was the last to follow, just in time to see the reflections finally break through. They didn't look like twisted versions of the crew anymore. They looked like something else entirely. Their faces were melting, their limbs bent wrong, their bodies warped and stretched in ways that weren't just unnatural. They were unfinished, like the ship was still deciding what they should be. The first one lifted its head, its half-formed mouth curled upward, and in a voice like cracking glass it whispered, "Where are you going?" Then it lunged. Kethel dived through the passage. The warden slammed the wall shut behind them. For a second, silence. Then from the other side, pounding, scratching, laughing. They weren't stopped, just delayed. Varys coughed, shaking. His voice was weak. We can't keep running forever." The warden turned, peering down the corridor ahead. "You won't have to." Jaina wiped sweat from her brow, glancing at Kethel. "I don't know what that means, but I hate it." Kethel exhaled. His pulse was still racing, but the warden was already moving, so, with no other choice, they followed. And in the distance, the warship began to hum, like it was waking up. The hum grew louder. It wasn't the steady, rhythmic pulse of an engine. It was breathing. The walls shuddered with it. The floor beneath their feet throbbed, almost imperceptibly. Kethel could feel it under his boots, something ancient stirring within the depths of the ship. Jaina's fingers twitched near her weapon. "I don't like this." "You've said that a lot," Rathak muttered, "because it keeps getting worse." Kethel agreed. Behind them, the pounding at the sealed passage had stopped. The reflections weren't trying to break through anymore. That was worse, much worse. The warden didn't seem concerned. It glided ahead, leading them deeper into the corridor, past walls lined with pulsing, vein-like wiring that should not have been there. Then they weren't alone anymore. The air shifted. A cold, suffocating weight pressed against them. Something was watching. Kethel stopped. "Did you feel that?" Jaina swallowed. "Yeah." Rathak's tail flicked nervously. "I don't see anything." That didn't mean nothing was there. The corridor ahead opened into a vast chamber. Unlike the rest of the warship, this part was pristine. No rust, no damage, no sign of the strange organic growth that had infested the ship's interior. At the center stood a throne, not a captain's chair, not a command seat, a throne. It was made of metal and bone, fused seamlessly together, pulsing with a soft, eerie glow. Strange symbols adorned its surface, shifting as if they were alive. And seated upon it was a man, or something that had once been a man. His uniform was ancient, worn and tattered, but unmistakably human. His skin was ashen, his body partially fused with the throne itself. His fingers, long, too long, rested lightly on the armrests, and his eyes opened. Gina inhaled sharply. Kethel felt his stomach drop, because those weren't human eyes. They were black voids, deep and endless, filled with unspoken knowledge. And when he spoke, his voice wasn't a whisper. It was thunder. "Who commands my vessel?" The room shook with the weight of his voice. Kethel's breath caught in his throat. The others stood frozen. The warden, for the first time, bowed its head. It spoke, its voice quiet. "Captain Elias, the cycle continues." Gina's fingers twitched. "He's alive?" Kethel didn't think so. Elias turned his head, his movements unnervingly slow. "The cycle." His eyes flickered across the crew, pausing on Kethel. "It chooses new players." Rathak stepped forward cautiously. "What cycle? What is this ship?" For a moment there was silence. Then Elias moved. His hand twitched. The ship responded. The walls hummed louder. The lights flashed. And outside the chamber, something screamed. The warden lifted its head. "They know you are here." Elias exhaled, a hollow sound. "Then we have little time." His gaze locked onto Kethel. "You wish to understand." Kethel hesitated. "Yes." Elias leaned forward. "Then let me show you." And with a single slow gesture, he reached toward Kethel's mind. The warship vanished. Kethel's body no longer felt solid. Instead, he was somewhere else. Someone else. Flashes of another time, another warship, another crew surged through his mind. Voices screaming, alarms blaring, a battle beyond comprehension unfolding in the void. He saw a younger Captain Elias standing on the bridge, barking orders. He saw alien vessels, twisted and wrong, moving like living nightmares. And he saw the moment the ship was lost. A desperate maneuver, a weapon never meant to be fired, a warship that should have been destroyed, but wasn't. Instead, it changed. Something took hold. And from that moment, it was no longer just a warship. It was something else, something hungry. Kethel's mind snapped back. The visions ended. He staggered, gasping, his head pounding. Gina caught his arm, steadying him. "Kethel, what happened?" He looked up at Elias, whose empty gaze watched him without emotion. "This ship," Kethel whispered, still reeling. "It isn't just a machine." Elias gave the faintest nod. "Number It is alive." Jaina stiffened. "And we're inside it." The warden turned its many eyes toward them. "Yes," Rathak exhaled sharply. "That's why the reflections are here, isn't it? They aren't just hunting us." His voice dropped. "They want the ship." Elias tilted his head as if listening to something distant. Then he spoke again. "They do not want it." His voice dropped to something colder, darker. "They want to become it." Gina's grip on her weapon tightened. Kethel's heart pounded. The pounding outside the walls returned. Louder this time, faster. The reflections were no longer waiting. And Captain Elias, the last commander of this ship, rose from his throne. His gaze burned with something ancient and terrible. "The cycle ends tonight." The pounding grew worse. The walls groaned, not from strain but anticipation. The warship was not afraid. It was waiting. Gina's hand shook as she gripped her rifle. "Kethel, tell me we have a plan." Kethel wasn't sure what to say, because plans required understanding, and right now nothing about this situation made sense. Captain Ilya stood at the heart of it all, his gaze locked on the sealed passage as if he could see through it. His presence alone sent chills down Kethel's spine. He wasn't a ghost, but he wasn't exactly alive either. And yet, the warship listened to him. Rathak took a cautious step forward, his tail flicking in unease. If this ship is alive, can it fight back? The warden, standing like a silent sentinel, finally spoke. "It does not fight," Gina scoffed. "Could have fooled me." The warden turned its many eyes toward her. "It consumes." Silence. A cold, heavy silence. Kethel felt something tighten in his chest. "Consumes what?" The warden blinked. "Everything." The reflections outside screamed. The door cracked. Something pushed through. A sliver of not skin, something stretched too tight over bones that weren't real. The shape was wrong, shifting and twisting like it was still learning how to exist. And its mouth, if it could be called that, grinned. "Let us in." The voice wasn't just one voice. It was many, the sound of every crew member they had lost. Gina's breath hitched. "We need to run." But Captain Ilias didn't move. He lifted his hand just slightly, and the warship responded. The air pressure changed. The walls shifted. Something unseen rippled through the ship, a pulse that ran beneath their feet. The lights dimmed, not because of failure, because of focus. A deep, low hum began to vibrate through the warship, growing in intensity. Kethel felt it in his bones, like the growl of a beast that had finally decided to bare its teeth. The reflections felt it too. Their grins faltered. No. The first one took a step back. The others followed. The warship's hum turned into a roar, and the ship opened its eyes. It wasn't visible. Not at first. But Kethel felt it. Something immense, something beyond shape or form, uncoiling deep within the heart of the warship. It had been asleep for a long time. Now it was waking up. Gina took a step back. "What did you do?" Captain Ilias smiled. Not like the reflections, not like a man who had lost his mind. Like a man who had waited a long time for this moment. "The warship remembers." A groan ran through the walls. Then they moved, not like doors, not like mechanisms shifting into place, like flesh tightening, like veins pulsing, like a great throat preparing to swallow. Kethel's pulse raced. "Ilias!" But the captain wasn't listening, because the reflections were trying to run, trying to escape. They had waited, hunted, whispered in the dark, but now they knew. They weren't the predators. They were the prey. And the warship was hungry. The first reflection turned to flee. It didn't make it. The wall split open behind it. Not metal, not machinery, a gaping maw. Teeth too many and too sharp snapped shut around the reflection's twisted body. It screamed, a high, distorted wail, before being dragged into the walls. The others panicked. They turned to the corridor. It wasn't there anymore. The ship moved around them. Kethel had seen ships with defenses before, but this wasn't defense. This was feeding. One by one, the reflections vanished. The walls took them, swallowed them, absorbed them. And all the while, Captain Ilias stood at the center of the chamber, watching. Silent, satisfied. Gina stared in horrified awe. Rathak's tail was puffed out in pure terror. This is unnatural." The warden didn't blink. "It is balance." Kethel wasn't sure what that meant. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. The last of the reflections screamed as it was pulled into the floor. Then, silence. The warship exhaled, a deep, slow release of something unseen, like a beast that had finished its meal. And then, just like that, it was over. The walls were still. The passage was open again, as if nothing had ever happened. But it had. Kethel knew it, Jaina knew it, and Captain Ilias. He turned toward them, his hollow black eyes watching with something almost like approval. "The warship is awake." Kethel's stomach twisted. "And now what?" Ilias tilted his head. "Now?" A slow smile crept across his face. "Now, we take it home." Silence. The kind that wasn't just absence of sound, but the weight of something unseen pressing down on them. The ship had fed. It had swallowed the reflections, absorbed them into its twisted anatomy. And now, with its hunger momentarily satisfied, the warship simply waited. Captain Ilias stood at the center of it all, his gaze fixed on Kethel like he was measuring something. Jaina was the first to break the silence. "Where exactly is home?" Ilias tilted his head, considering her question as if it was strange to him. Then he said something that made Kethel's blood run cold. "The war is not over." Rathak's tail flicked sharply. "What war?" Ilias didn't answer. Instead, he reached out, not physically, but through the ship itself. The walls trembled. A pulse ran through them, deeper than metal, deeper than structure. Something vast moved beneath the surface, like an ocean shifting beneath ice. And then the ship responded. The chamber's walls began to peel apart, revealing something beyond them. A window, not glass, not a view screen, a living wound in reality. And through it, they saw the battlefield. Kethel's breath caught in his throat. The sight beyond the window was impossible. It was a battlefield, but not in space, not in any star system they recognized. Ships floated, frozen in time, some human, some not. Ruined hulls drifted, their surfaces scorched with energy weapons never seen before. Bodies, some skeletal, some preserved in a way that defied reason, hung in the void like forgotten echoes. And at the heart of it all, a ship larger than planets. Not a fleet, not a station, a single war machine, broken and waiting, its core still pulsing faintly with life. Jaina exhaled. "That's not possible." Rathak took a slow step forward. That's precursor tech." Kethel could barely process it. The ship wasn't just large. It was monstrous, its surface covered in unfamiliar patterns, shifting like language, like thought. Captain Ilias stared at it, reverently. "This is where it began," he said. His voice was quiet, almost distant. "Where humanity changed, where we earned our place." Jaina's fingers tightened around her weapon. "What do you mean?" Ilias turned to her. "This was our first contact." The silence that followed was suffocating. Kethel swallowed hard. "With who?" Ilias gave him a slow smile. "With the ones who made war into something more." Kethel didn't know how to process what he was hearing, because history didn't mention this. Humanity had fought wars, yes, but not like this, not against something that could freeze battlefields in time, not against something so large it made dreadnoughts look like specks of dust. Jaina took a shaky breath. "This isn't in any records." Ilias nodded. "Because no one was meant to remember." Rathak's tail flicked sharply. "That's impossible. There's no way you can erase something this big." Ilias looked at him. "You think this is the only battlefield?" Kethel's blood turned to ice. "You think this was the worst of it?" Something clicked in Kethel's mind. The warship they stood in wasn't just advanced. It wasn't just alive. It was part of something bigger. "Tell me," Ilias said. taking a slow step toward them, his black void-like eyes flickering with something unknowable. "When you boarded this ship, did you ever stop to wonder why it was still here?" Kethel's pulse quickened. It was a good question. They had assumed it was a relic, a ghost ship drifting in forgotten space. But what if it wasn't? What if it had never been lost? What if it had been waiting? Rathak tensed. "What are you saying?" Ilyas smiled. "I'm saying this warship was never abandoned." The walls shifted, the floor hummed, and deep within the ship, something awoke. Something that was not Ilyas, something older, and it had just noticed them. Jaina took a step back. What's happening?" The warden lowered its head. "It knows?" Rathak's fur bristled. "It?" The warden did not blink. "The warship?" A deep vibration ran through the floor. A presence pressed against them, not with sound, not with motion, but with thought. Something vast, something that remembered. And then, in a voice that was not spoken but felt, it addressed them. "You are not the first." The words throbbed in Kethel's skull, an imprint that didn't just exist in sound, but in memory. Jaina's breathing quickened. Rathak froze. Even Captain Ilyas, who had stood calm through everything, bowed his head. The warship's voice was not human, not alien. It was beyond both. "You come seeking knowledge, seeking history, seeking truth." A pause. The ship's presence grew heavier. "Do you wish to know?" Kethel couldn't speak, because something told him. If they said yes, they might never be the same again. Silence pressed against them. Not the silence of space, not the silence of an empty room. The silence of something waiting. The warship had spoken. "Do you wish to know?" The words hung in the air, more than sound, a weight in their minds. A question with meaning far beyond the simple phrasing. Kethel couldn't breathe. Jaina's fingers tightened around her weapon, but she didn't raise it. What was the point? If the warship wanted them dead, they would already be gone. Rathak's fur bristled. "I don't like this." The warden remained motionless, its many eyes watching, waiting. Captain Ilyas, however, was smiling. He took a step forward, raising his hands as if addressing something far greater than the people in the room. "We do," he said softly. "We wish to know." Kethel felt something shift. The air thickened. The walls rippled, and the warship reacted. The ship did not speak in words. It spoke in memories. A sudden pull, a wrenching sensation, and Kethel wasn't standing on the warship anymore. He was somewhere else, a battlefield. Not the kind with trenches, not the kind fought over dirt and land. This was a war of stars. Vast burning wrecks drifted in the abyss. The sky above was filled with dying embers, starships cracking apart, their insides spilling out into the void. And through it all, human ships. They were smaller than their enemies, weaker, outnumbered. But they did not break. They did not retreat. They fought like monsters, number like gods. Kethel could feel it, the sheer ferocity, the raw, unyielding drive that kept them fighting even when they should have been annihilated. And at the center of it all, the first warship, not just a machine, not just metal and fire. It was something else, something alive, something willing to do what no other species would dare. Kethel felt himself pulled deeper. The memory shifted. The battlefield was gone. Now he stood in a chamber much like the one they were in, but older. A figure sat in the center, surrounded by dozens of others. Scientists, commanders, survivors. A voice spoke, a woman's voice, strong, unshaken. "They won't stop. They won't negotiate. They won't leave us alive." The figures around her said nothing. She continued, "We tried diplomacy. We tried surrender. We tried everything." She turned to the others. To Kethel. Not because she saw him, because the memory was so real, it felt as if she were speaking directly to him. "They will not stop." A beat of silence. Then the next words changed everything. "So we won't either." The room rippled with quiet understanding. Not fear, not regret, just resolve. "Are we all in agreement?" she asked. One by one, the figures nodded. And then the warship was born, not as a machine, not as a weapon, but as something else, something alive, something that could learn, something that could never, ever die. Kethel was yanked back into reality. The warship's presence receded, leaving him shaken, breathless, and cold. He turned to Jaina. Her face was pale. She had seen it too. Rathak's claws twitched, his breathing uneven. That was not normal. The warden stared at them. "You have seen." Captain Ilias's expression was unreadable. "And now you understand." Kethel swallowed. "Understand what?" Jaina was the one who answered. "This ship isn't just a weapon." She turned toward the walls, her voice hollow. "It's a promise. A promise that humanity would never lose again. A promise that if their enemies would not stop, then neither would they." Kethel felt his stomach churn, because he understood now. The warship wasn't just alive. It wasn't just a tool. It was the war itself, and it had been waiting for one thing: the next battle. A deep rumble filled the chamber. The ship had heard their thoughts. It had seen their understanding, and it had decided. The warship's voice returned, a presence that pressed against their minds. "You are ready." Jaina stepped back. "Ready for what?" The warship answered, "To finish what we started." The chamber was still. The walls seemed to pulse as if the warship itself was alive with expectation. The air around them was thick with something ancient, something hungry. Kethel's mind was still racing, the weight of what he had just learned bearing down on him. The warship wasn't just a weapon, it was the very embodiment of human survival, the last line of defense against an enemy so vast, so terrifying, that humanity had created it to ensure they would never be destroyed. Jaina was the first to speak. "So, what now?" The words felt heavy, the reality of them sinking into Kethel's chest like a stone. "What do we do now?" Ilias, still standing like a statue at the center of the chamber, slowly turned to face them. His black eyes gleamed with something unreadable, but there was no fear in him, only an infinite patience. "The question," he said softly, "is not what you will do now. The question is whether you can handle what comes next." A low hum began to resonate through the ship once more. The ship was not just awake, it was aware, conscious of their presence, conscious of their decision. Kethel felt a pull, a compelling force that seemed to tug at his very soul. The warship was waiting, but it wasn't just waiting for the crew to follow. It was waiting to see if they were ready to be part of it. Jaina's voice broke through his thoughts. "Part of what? We've seen what this ship does. It consumes, it destroys. We've seen the reflections. And those visions you showed us, Captain. What does the warship really want from us?" Ilias exhaled, his eyes narrowing. "It's not about what the warship wants from you. It's about what you need from it." The words didn't make sense. "We need to stop running." The warden's voice was quiet, but its presence was powerful enough to stop everyone in their tracks. Rathak's tail lashed angrily. "Stop running? You expect us to fight? To—" The warden cut him off with a single steady glance. There is no choice. Kethiel felt the weight of the warship's presence settling on his shoulders, the gravity of their situation sinking in deeper. The war wasn't over. It wasn't just about survival anymore. They were now inextricably linked to the warship's fate. The warden spoke again, its voice steady and unwavering. It's time to choose. The war is not finished, and you are part of it. Rathak grunted in frustration. I don't understand. What do you want from us? Are we supposed to fight for this thing, this ship, or are we just its tools? Ilyas didn't flinch. You are vessels, just like the warship. You were chosen to carry the battle forward. Jaina recoiled slightly. Chosen? By who? Ilyas's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. By the war itself. You're alive because it willed you to be, and you are here because it has called you. Suddenly, everything felt wrong. Kethel's thoughts were scattered. He looked at the others, at Jaina, Rathak, and Varys, who still trembled with shock, though he said nothing, and then back at Ilyas. You're saying we have no choice, that the warship wants us to join its battle, that we're part of it. Ilyas nodded slowly. The ship chooses its crew, and it chooses its commanders. The tension in the room was palpable. Jaina spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. But this is a living weapon. It's not a ship. It's a force of nature. How are we supposed to command it? How can we even understand it? Ilyas's gaze was steady. You don't understand it. None of you do. Not yet. The warden's voice cut in sharply. You will. The ship rumbled again, deeper now, its hum vibrating through Kethel's bones. The floor beneath their feet felt as though it was alive, shifting with the pulse of the warship's heart. Kethel instinctively stepped back, his hand on the weapon at his side, unsure of what to do next. We can't just fight this, Jaina said quietly, almost pleading. Not like we're the enemy. Ilyas's expression softened, and he nodded. Number you are not the enemy. You are its inheritors. Rathak's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? Ilyas's smile was dark, knowing. It means the warship has already chosen, and now it's time for you to choose what to do with it. The moment stretched on, hanging in the air like an impossible decision. The walls, the ship itself, seemed to watch them, waiting for the decision to be made. And then the hum increased. Something stirred within the ship, something vast, ancient, and terrible. Kethiel could feel it, like a presence moving through the ship, reaching out, connecting with him. His chest tightened as if the warship had wrapped its fingers around his heart. It was asking him to join it, to become a part of its endless battle. But was this his fight? Was this what humanity was meant to be a part of? Or were they simply being used? Kethiel started, his voice shaking for the first time since they had boarded the warship. What if we don't want to be part of it? What if we don't want this war? What happens then? Ilyas's eyes darkened and his smile vanished. Then the warship will consume you, like it has consumed everything else. The warden turned its many eyes toward them, and in that moment Kethel saw something in its gaze, a cold finality that sent a shiver down his spine. This ship does not lose, it does not retreat, and it does not rest. Kethiel's eyes scanned the others, the weight of the decision crushing him. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were part of something much larger, something ancient, and they had no idea what it would mean to accept it. But they couldn't leave. They couldn't run. Not anymore. The warship had chosen them. They had no choice but to choose it. Jaina stepped forward, her eyes wide with understanding and fear. We fight. We fight because it's the only way to stop this. Rathak nodded. We fight or we die. Varys, still pale, stepped forward as well. We have no choice but to fight. Kethel took a slow breath. His hand tightened around his weapon. Then we fight, he said, his voice steady for the first time in what felt like ages. We fight, and we win. And as the warship vibrated around them, as the walls rippled, Kethel knew one thing with certainty. The battle had already begun. The hum of the warship grew louder, more insistent, as though the ship itself was feeling the crew's decision. Every part of it vibrated with purpose, a pulsating force that seemed to push them forward, toward something greater. The crew stood together, the weight of their choice hanging heavily in the air. They had agreed. They had decided to fight. But there was no turning back now. The warship's presence surrounded them, pressing in on their minds, linking them to its ancient will. They could feel it in their bones. This was the beginning of something terrible and necessary. Rathak flexed his claws, the tension still evident in his posture. "So what now?" he growled. Jaina glanced at him, her eyes steely. "Now we fight, Rathak. We do what we came here to do." Kethel looked to Ilias, who stood still, almost waiting. The captain's hollow eyes were filled with a kind of quiet satisfaction. He had already known what would happen. He had already accepted this path. "The war is never over," Ilias said softly, as if imparting a secret. "It doesn't stop. But now you understand what it is, what it means to be part of it. You are no longer just soldiers. You are commanders of this ship, and as long as you stand here, you will fight. Not for yourselves, but for everything." A pulse of energy surged through the ship. A vision flashed before Kethel's eyes. He saw the vast expanse of space, filled with ruins and remnants of battles fought long before humanity ever reached the stars. The warship had seen it all. It had been a part of it, a weapon of creation and destruction, driven by the desire to never lose. Kethel's hands clenched into fists. "We don't have to fight alone, do we?" Ilias didn't reply immediately. Instead, he looked toward the window where the vast battlefield still loomed, frozen in time. "The warship calls to the others, but it cannot win alone. The war must be fought by those who choose it, by those who are ready." Kethel looked at Jaina, at Rathak, at Varys, and felt a strange certainty. They were ready. They had to be ready. Suddenly, the warship spoke, not with words, but through the very fabric of the ship itself. The sound was not something they heard, but something they felt, deep in their hearts. A calling, a signal, a command. "Prepare." And then the ship opened. Not just a door or a hatch. The warship itself split, its walls peeling back to reveal the stars, the black void of space. A fleet of human ships emerged from the heart of the warship, sleek, powerful, their engines humming with an energy Kethel couldn't understand, but he could feel it. The warship had given birth to a new fleet, its new commanders. "This is it," Kethel whispered, his voice steady but full of awe. "The war isn't just ours anymore. It's humanity's." Ilias's voice was soft. "You are now the heart of this ship, the vessel of its will. You carry the war with you, and you will decide its course." The fleet had formed around them, ready for whatever came next. The stars outside stretched into darkness, but within that darkness was something new. It was no longer the remnants of a lost war. It was the beginning of a new battle, a battle where humanity wasn't just fighting to survive. They were fighting to control it. Kethel stood at the helm, his mind clear, his hands steady on the controls. "Let's make sure we're ready. The war will not stop, but neither will we." Jaina stood by his side, her weapon holstered, ready to command. "We fight for the future, for everything, for humanity's future. Rathok stood at the back, his tail flicking. If the ship wants us to fight, then we will. We will fight until the end. Ilias nodded, and then, for the first time, Kethel saw the captain's eyes, not full of hollow darkness, but something familiar, something human. Then let it begin. The warship's engines roared to life, its massive form gliding into the vastness of space. The fleet followed, ready, powered by something far greater than mere survival, powered by the promise that they would never lose again. As the warship hurtled through the stars, its voice echoed inside Kethel's mind. We are the end and the beginning. We are the war that cannot be stopped. And now you fight for all of us. Kethel closed his eyes for a brief moment. The weight of what they had just committed to pressed against him, but he knew, deep down, that it was the only path. The warship had shown them the way, and now it was their turn to lead. The stars outside grew brighter, the fleet moving forward into the unknown. And as the warship breathed, so did they.